Hi, welcome to the Go Higher Frequency Astrology channel. My name is Suzanne. Today I'm going to be talking about the final Pisces lunar eclipse that's happening on August the 28th. It's an important eclipse because it marks the midpoint between the announcement of this new Saturn-Neptune cycle that really won't start until 2027. I talk about it mainly from the mundane perspective, but I add a little bit about how you can understand this eclipse from the personal perspective at the end of this video. As always, I've put timestamps below, so feel free to skip around to the parts that interest you the most. Saturn-Neptune conjunction in February announced the transition of a larger collective cycle from the cross of planning, which began in 1615, to the cross of the sleeping phoenix beginning in 2027. I've already recorded a video about this transition, so if you're interested in learning more about these cycles, I'll link that video below. This Pisces full moon eclipse on the cross of spirit is symbolic of that transition as a combination of those crosses. We still have the collective skills and focus in the background in the design gates of 16-9, while the individual spirit of the personality gates 59 and 6 is in the foreground. This chart located in Washington, D.C. also displays angles very similar to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, with the ascendant-descendant flipped from the United States Sibley chart. Everything is turned upside down right now. The eclipse is revealing our desperate fight over resources. There's a growing awareness of the mean-spirited hoarding and destruction of our resources by a very few. We are observing a global climax of devastating sanctions by those who control the money flow. Both the inhumaneness of these sanctions on the average citizen, but also the limits of this type of extortion over others. Both Mars and Pluto are out of bounds in this chart. Mars in Cancer in the second house, ruled by this lunar eclipse, is symbolic of this desperate fight for resources in our waterways, while Pluto in Aquarius in the ninth house is symbolic of the power dynamics on display overseas. Mars and Pluto are in what is called an inversion to each other. They're in signs that don't see one another. They have blind spots in regards to one another. So there is little chance that we're going to find common ground between these two forces. Meanwhile, an intercepted Venus in Libra is separating from an opposition to an intercepted Saturn in the 11th house, while Mars is applying to a square to the Saturn. Now, Venus is in the sign of Saturn's exaltation, so Saturn accepts Venus's demands. Saturn is the ruler of the 8th house, which is financial contracts with other countries, the 9th house, which rules other countries and our relationships with other countries, and the 10th house is symbolic of the executive branch. And Saturn is the traditional ruler of the 10th house, while Uranus is the modern ruler. And Venus is sitting in this 5th house and rules this 12th house. So Venus could represent hidden financial dealings, hidden financial contracts, things that we are not very clear about. And the 5th house is also what's called the gambling house, or the house that rules the predictive markets or the stock markets. While a debilitated Mars in Cancer rules Saturn. So Saturn is compelled to play by Mars' rules, whether it likes it or not. And Mars rules the 6th house of the military. There's this lack of munitions that we've heard about, and there's a tension also growing between the executive branch and those serving on the ground. And you see this fight for resources very clearly in the human design chart as well, with Mars in the gate of provocation and this full moon in the gate of abundance. And this is forming this emoting channel for the entire collective. It's a moody and volatile channel, and it really determines how we're feeling when our cup is either empty or full. So it could swing back from highs and lows very quickly. We last saw this channel connected for the entire collective in late May during the full moon in Sagittarius. At that time, Venus was in this gate of provocation. And right before that full moon, Venus was applying to a square to Saturn in the gate of control. Now, leading up to that square, there were financial or Venus sanctions, Saturn placed on Iran. And the DOJ, Saturn, started an inquiry into E. Jean Carroll, Venus. And within minutes of that square perfecting, a rocket from Blue Origin exploded. And Blue Origin has its natal Venus in Libra. So that transit was forming a T-square in its chart, with Saturn forming an opposition to its natal Venus. And interestingly, the founder, Jeff Bezos, also has a Venus-Saturn conjunction in his chart. Now, we've already heard that the Supreme Court declined to hear the E. Jean Carroll case for the second time just a few days ago. Venus perfected its opposition on August 20th, today, the day that I started to record this video. And yesterday, Scott Bessent announced a surprise extra buyback period of old U.S. Treasury bonds because the yields on the Treasury bonds have been climbing to an alarming degree. And so this had the immediate effect of lowering the bond yields, and the stock market rallied yesterday. And this move signaled a crisis brewing. So this intervention did not last long. We are seeing today that the bond yields have climbed back up and the stock market dropped once again. And also on the night of the 19th, Trump announced new sanctions on anyone doing business with Iran. So this morning on the 20th, as this opposition moved closer, China lashed back at this plan because they are one of the largest traders with Iran. Mars square Saturn is much more damaging, especially when both planets are debilitated. As Saturn attempts to control, Mars will provoke a collective wave about our lack of resources. There might be additional attacks, panics, protests, and market swings. Again, we have two emotional channels connected for the entire collective. And we are already seeing heightened emotional responses. So we're likely to see additional emotional swings as we head in to the eclipse that happens on August the 28th. 8 days from now. So we have a long period of emotional responses. This Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aries in April also seeded a few serious outbreaks like the hantavirus, the mpox virus, and possibly even the Ebola virus, even though it wasn't officially discovered until May. So we may see further developments with the square. Ebola in particular has topped over 5,000 cases in the Congo since May, and it has over 50% mortality rate. This is the deadliest outbreak of Ebola in Congo's history. And as the cases rise, it'll be harder and harder to contain in this one area. Uranus, the planet symbolizing disruption and chaos, is in the 12th house, and it's squaring this eclipse. Uranus is ruled by Mercury, which is under the beams of the sun, and it's conjunct the south node. Mercury rules the 1st and 5th houses. Behind the scenes disruptions to temporary agreements bailouts or other types of news impacting our security might play out as more volatility in the stock market. The Sun and Mercury are in the last lines of the 59th gate. And if you remember, the South Node had moved to this gate and line right when the president traveled to meet with Xi Jinping in China. The theme of this gate is about achieving fertile growth through temporary unions one would normally eschew. It's about prudence, the wisdom to see things truly as they are, teaching us how to pick our battles in a way that invites other people to join us. Now, these temporary unions are being disrupted during this eclipse. The risk calculation has shifted. And you can see this shift in calculation with Venus's position in gate 57. And this is the gate that epitomizes intuition. And it's now connected to Uranus in gate 20, the gate of manifestation in the now, forming this channel of the brainwave. Now, there are likely people who are closer to these agreements that are going to benefit from this chaos, while the rest of us are going to see our resources impacted, and we're going to be emotionally impacted by these changes, and people are going to start to panic probably and start to protest because of this destruction that's happening that is benefiting only a few. Jupiter, the ruler of this full moon eclipse, sits here in the third house in Leo, and it's applying to a trine to Saturn, intercepted in the 11th house in Aries. And this is marking an important turning point in the Iran war, because if you remember, the US attacked Iran's nuclear facilities starting in June of 2025. And during that attack, Jupiter was applying to a square to Saturn. And Jupiter in Leo is now in opposition to that seeding point, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius that happened in December of 2020, with Saturn now in sextile to that conjunction. Now, Jupiter in the human design chart is in the last line of gate 33. And the gate 33 is about secrets. It is the gate where Trump has his Pluto, and Trump has his Pluto out of bounds in Leo. And this is in the last line of this gate. And it's about this inability to completely let go of something from the past before it can move on to a place of influence. Now, if you remember in Trump's first term, Trump had torn up the JCPOA, and he had severely tightened financial sanctions on Iran. And he has been trying ever since to become the person that makes Iran surrender, whereas past presidents couldn't. And in response to this and ongoing sabotage events from this administration, during this time of the seeding point in December of 2020, Iran's parliament passed a strategic counteraction law requiring the government to step up uranium enrichment and restrict International Atomic Energy Agency inspections if sanctions weren't lifted. So the entire motivation that Trump has said, which was, preventing Iran's nuclear enrichment, pretty much was turned on its head. And now Trump is in a different quandary. And here is Iran wanting sanctions to be lifted by leveraging an entire different mechanism. They've moved on from uranium enrichment, and now they're holding him hostage over the Strait of Hormuz, whereas Trump has repeatedly said this war is about atomic weapons. And it's not even atomic weapons that are being negotiated now. So he's dug himself a worse hole. Now, Jupiter rules the 7th house, and it also rules the 11th house where Saturn is intercepted. So Saturn is in a bind and is being blocked in by Jupiter here in this 3rd house. Now, trine energies are easy flowing energies, but does that mean there'll be a negotiation? Well, right now, Jupiter is ruled by this Sun-Mercury conjunction, which is about temporary agreements. And so I think we might have a temporary agreement on the table, but I'm assuming we're going to have to wait until the opposition, until we have a more definitive outcome of a truce on the table. And we'll have to see more pain for both countries before we get to that agreement, I'm afraid. More pain for the innocent citizens of both countries and the world before we get to that truce that an opposition usually demonstrates. Now, this eclipse is related to the Pisces new moon from February of 2025. This was right around the time that they cut USAID as one of Doge's first cost-saving initiatives. It was on the cross of migration, which is symbolic of this immigration issue that we're all dealing with in the West. And our attack on Iran also happened on this cross of migration in February. And when you think about this immigration issue, if you zoom out, you have an understanding that we are the source of the immigration issue. We're the source of this immigration issue because the powers that be wanted to globalize so that they could have cheap labor. They started this issue that's now in motion. And then they also exasperated this issue by the sanctions that they put on other countries. So more and more people from other countries that couldn't survive in the countries that had sanctions, in the countries where war was incited because of instability, these immigrants needed a way to survive. And so, of course, they went to look for opportunities in the West. And instead of taking a hard look at our own policies, politics has basically placed the blame on the immigrants so that the politicians could gain more power and shift the blame. The companies who have eked out all of the resources from the citizens and have put more of the share of the growth in companies and investors' hands, they've basically created this problem and exasperated this problem. And now the West has to deal with it. They're waking up, even though it's still very powerful, this onus to put blame on the immigrants that are in the country. Once the immigrants are gone, what are we going to do? You know, there's not going to be anybody to blame. But the fight is still very central in our country. The pitting one against the other is very central still to our country. And they're trying to solve this issue with AI, with further controlling the country's citizens so they can't protest, so they can't have a right to speak out, so they can't have a right to protest. They're trying to in place more controls on the citizens, and the citizens are fighting back, the citizens of other countries and the citizens within the country, adding to the instability in the world. Now, if you look at the Sibley chart, you see that this new moon brought the 10th house to the first house. So it is involving the very identity of our country. Mars is approaching a return in Cancer to this new moon, and Venus is now transiting the first house and just past an opposition with the new moon's Venus in Aries, where Saturn sits here. And so we're seeing a lot of restrictions on our allies, but also restrictions on our own security. So whatever we're doing is impacting ourselves. And that is really what the first seventh house demonstrates. It's an axis. So the whole proverb of do unto others as you would have them do unto you is true, because it's an axis. Whatever you do to another is going to be reflected back on you at any given time. And so it's very demonstrative of the dynamics that we're dealing with right now. Now, I want to talk about this from the personal perspective as well, because anybody who has their personal planets in early Pisces degrees and in late Leo degrees, you are feeling these eclipses more personally. And I'm one of those people. I have my sun at 22 degrees of Aquarius, and I have my moon at 3 degrees of Pisces. So both of my lights have been impacted by this eclipse. And if you think about the themes that I just talked about from the mundane perspective, you can apply them to your own chart. So using myself as an example, in February of 2025, I had just been experiencing the last hit of my Chiron return. And I had a friend who had reached out to me about my ums and ahs about my videos, because at the time I was trying to be more spontaneous and not be particularly perfectionistic in my videos, which is part of me that paralyzes me in the ways that I create, because I can be a perfectionist and I need to learn how to let that go. And at the time, it put me in overdrive in that perfectionistic part of me that did not want to see my imperfections so clearly, did not want to go through that pain of perfection in my videos, of the pain of seeing myself with this inability to actually communicate, really, because my Pisces moon is very sensitive and it has an inability to communicate really what I'm feeling at any given time. My Pisces is something that I feel intuitively. It doesn't have language to it. And so it gets stuck, the communication. It gets stuck with the wave. I have the 3955 wave in my chart. So it gets stuck in this wave of back and forth, this inability to communicate what I'm feeling at any given point. And so that's what I was dealing with at the new moon. And since then, I have really been dealing with, okay, well, what is the point when I can allow myself more freedom, when I can spend less time on these videos? And I've been joining different groups like Toastmasters to try to deal with this way that I'm unable to let go of my perfectionism. When am I going to be able to let go? When you look at this eclipse that's happening in my whole house system, it's really happening in this 12th house, 6th house aspect. You know, the anxiety that I feel in presenting, in not wanting to show my inadequacies, basically. In my perfectionistic tendencies. And there were these negotiations that I had with myself, these temporary negotiations that, okay, well, when I get to this certain point, then I'll let go. When I get to this certain point, then I'll let go. I've made this temporary negotiation, which is being disrupted. And I can no longer do what I'm doing anymore, because it takes up a lot of time, my perfectionism. But I've experienced this from the point of view of being able to understand that more clearly, being able to see the disruption that's happening from an external point of view and how it's impacting my health and my work. And now, hopefully, I can move on from that. The 10th house is where Mars is out of bounds, this need to make advancements in my career, this need to move quicker so that I can produce things quicker, so that I can increase my income, because I haven't been able to drive a lot of income because I'm spending so much time producing at any given time. And Pluto is in my 5th whole sign house. And so it is on overdrive to figure out, well, what do I do about my need to be an individual and to create in my own way, and also be able to let go of some of my perfectionism. We're not at the eclipse yet. It also has a window before and after. We're seeing the eclipse manifest already, but it also has a window after the eclipse. So as the eclipse gets closer and closer, we're going to have more emotional intensity in the world. We're going to see that emotional intensity, and we're going to have to deal with that emotional intensity. And for me, it's also about really coming to terms with the chaos that comes into my life that throws me off track, that just basically disrupts my ability to be perfectionistic, which forces my hands to make adjustments. And then there is the time period after the eclipse, which we're still dealing with the outcomes or the manifestations of that eclipse. So I hope that gave you some insight into how you can look at the ways that you have been making temporary negotiations that are being uprooted or disrupted, that forces your hands to look at the ways that you're dealing emotionally with a situation, that makes you release something about the ways that you've been making these temporary negotiations, so you can move on to a place that is, in a sense, better, because you're really dealing with things as they are, and forming better relationships to whatever it is that you need to do to move forward in a more influential manner in your world. And I also wanted to remind you that I'm also still offering that Eclipse Special if you want to check that out. What are the current issues that you're dealing with as the eclipses switch into the Aquarius Leo axis, and what are you releasing? I'd love to meet you, and I hope otherwise that you got a lot from this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.